least it happened in the driveway.
Welcome back, Outlaws. On today's episode, we're going to be replacing the complete fuel filter assembly with primer on our 2004 Chevy Silverado Duramax diesel, so stay tuned. Well, let's get the hood open and see what kind of a job we're in for. It shouldn't be too bad. I'm sure many of you out there have run into the same issue of losing the prime on your fuel pump. It tends to be pretty frustrating and always happens at the wrong place at the wrong time. I usually try to rebuild my stock parts with kits. I did some research to find the O-rings that go in the top of this primer pump. I checked with the dealer. They didn't sell O-ring kits for rebuilding this. They only sell the whole unit. I also checked with parts houses locally, and they didn't sell a kit either. After exhausting all my local resources, I turned to the internet and was able to find O-ring kits, but didn't trust that the sizes would be correct and the quality of the rings would be to my standards. Taking a quick look before we get started, these are the wires for the fuel filter heater. And we got to remove some clamps here. It looks like it'll be a pretty straightforward job. What I finally ended up doing, after calling the dealership again and finding the top filter piece with the primer pump for $212 and the additional cost of the filter at $75, I was able to find this on eBay, a complete unit, for $120. That seemed like the best option for me. The seller claims this to be an AC Delco part that is OEM. This should work out pretty good because then I don't have to use an O-ring kit and several different parts and hope that it doesn't leak afterward. This sure looks like the right part, but what we'll do after we get the original out is we'll lay them side by side and compare them to verify that it's correct. Alright, looking down here, we have these little clamps on the fuel lines that we need to get off and slide down so we get the fuel lines off. And back here, we have the two bolts that hold it on. We'll get working on those now. Right here is where I usually drop something and start cussing. There's not really enough room to get on the back of this with a socket, so you just use an open-end wrench and do the best you can. And finally, we got it out. Now it's time to get those little fuel line clamps off. Sometimes they tend to be kind of tricky because they have little tabs that you have to pinch together so that you can slide it down over the hose. Now that we have both of the fuel lines off and the unit laying on its side, it's time to remove the fuel heater wire connection and the little connection that connects down below for draining the water out of the fuel filter. This connection here is for the fuel filter. As you can see, there's a little plastic tab that you need to push with the screwdriver that allows it to release so you can unplug it. After unplugging the connection for the water separate on the bottom of the filter, we're ready to lay them side by side and do some comparisons before we install the new one. Always verify the parts for your specific vehicle when you're ordering them and when you receive them to ensure that they're a proper fit. And looking at these connections, they seem to be lining up just right. After looking at several of these, this seemed to be the best one. It's an AC Delco, and the seller claims that it's OEM. Alright, after checking it out, it's time to get this thing installed, and we're going to be putting it back in pretty much the exact order we took it out. First, we're going to connect our fuel heater. What you're listening for and feeling for here is a good click when you put the connector together. That ensures that it's sealed and has a good connection. That click you just heard was it. Next, we'll work on getting the fuel lines hooked up. By doing this now, this will allow us a little more flexibility in moving the filter around as we bolt it up. Doing this properly and making sure that the clamps are seated is a really important step, because if you don't, you're going to have fuel leaks. There's a little rib, and you want to make sure that your hose seats on that while the clamp holds it tight. Now we can go ahead and make the connection for the water separator at the bottom of the fuel filter. Once again, you're going to want that good sound click to make sure that you have a good connection. At this point, so that I'm not holding the filter in one hand and trying to make the connection with the other, I'm going to put this one bolt in so it holds the top of the filter in place so that I could easily make that connection. Okay, let's get this one last bolt in and get it tightened up. I didn't really have a torque spec for these, but they left little hash marks on the tops of the bolts, so I went ahead and tightened them down and got them right back to where they were, and then tightened them down just a little further. Okay, now that we've got it installed, let's just kind of go over what we put in and make sure everything's together. There's the fuel lines. Here's the fuel heater and the connection there. We got our bolts done, tightened up. And next we should work on bleeding it out. This next step is really important to do so you can get all the air out of the fuel filter and get it full of fuel and primed so that your engine will start. This priming screw is made of plastic, so be careful, number one, that you don't drop it and lose it, and number two, that you don't cross thread it. This next step is kind of tedious and takes up to 100 pumps sometimes, but it's really important to get all that air out. So what you're going to want to do is you want to continuously pump down on the top of this pump until you see fuel start to flow up out of the hole. What you want to do also is lay a rag down to collect some of that fuel so it doesn't spill onto your engine. Over time, the O-rings under this cap wore out and allowed the pump to lose its prime. As you can see, it does take some time to get the fuel up into the fuel filter, so don't be discouraged. Keep at it. It's a good time for safety glasses. You want to make a few pumps and get most of the air out before you put the little cap back in. As I mentioned before, these little plugs are plastic, and this one definitely wanted to cross thread on me. So if I wasn't careful, it would have been easy to do. It did take some time to get this screwed in just right. Once I felt safe that it wasn't cross-threaded, I went ahead and tightened it up with a screwdriver. After rechecking everything, I take a clean towel and dry up any fuel that may have spilled out to make it easier to check for leaks when we start the truck up. I guess the next thing on the agenda is to be changing the oil now. I hope you liked the video. If you did, hit that like button, share it, and please consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching.